Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My dear students of Master's final year, how you folks are doing? I hope you people are in a hale and hearty mood and bracing for listening to my lecture. In my today's session, I will discuss the concept of poetry and poet of Walt Whitman, and besides, I will also discuss some of the salient characteristics of Walt Whitman's poetry. And let me first tell you the concept of poet and poetry by Walt Whitman. And you know, my dear students, that Walt Whitman is a pioneer poet in American literature, in prose as well as in poetry. In the 1855 preface to Leaves of Grass, Whitman had presented his conception of poet and poetry of the future. The greatest poet, according to him, is the most complete lover of the universe and draws his materials directly from nature. He is a seer or a prophet who sees the cosmic plan which unites the past, present, and the future in harmonious sequence. No subject is trivial or pretty. No subject is trivial or petty for the poet, for it is his function to find hidden significances and a spiritual meaning in the ordinary and physical facts. What is more, science and its practical movements, he feels and he checks. He feels and no checks, but actually sources of encouragement to the greatest poet. And let us, my dear students, assess some of the salient characteristics of Whitman's poetry. And undoubtedly, the most important feature of Whitman's poetry is the glorification and treatment of self. To his concept of self is all pervasive, and self is related all the other aspects of his poetry, such as treatment of love and sex and treatment of death, his mysticism and the democratic impulse. The concept I, which is the egotism in Whitman's poetry. An egotist is a person who perpetually talks about himself. The perpetual use of I in Whitman's poetry certainly indicates the egotist. Whitman constantly refers to himself, celebrates himself, sings himself. Song of Myself is the most prominent evidence of this, but other poems too indicate it. All experience, all thought, all belief, all appearance in Whitman's poetry are referred back to the ego. And I know that the hand of God is the promise of my own self, not always personal. However, Whitman's poetry is not dominated by a narrow views of I or a restricted kind of egotism. The I in his poetry is not only the individual but the collective ego of humanity, for which Whitman attempts an imaginative and sympathetic identification of himself with every other individual self. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. He claims nothing for himself which he does not concede to all. We may call Whitman's egotism objective and collective. He sings of universal qualities through himself, as A.E. Briggs puts it. He sings of himself, but his imaginative self is composed of the selves of the exhaustless variety of mankind, from the great, the average, to the degraded. Self not passive or static. The self in Whitman's poems is not passive or static. It enjoys free movement. It is a voyager, and to know the universe itself as a road, as many roads for traveling souls. The vision of self is unlimited. As R.V. Chase observes, there is no place where at any moment it may not be, no thing or person with whom it may not merge, no act in which it may not participate. I skirt Sirius, my palms cover continents, I am afoot with my vision. Ambiguous states of self in Whitman's poetry. Self or I in Whitman's poetry may stand for the poet, or it may stand for any other person. In the first place, the I is autobiographical. Camerado, this is no book. Who touches this touches a man, and the man is the poet himself. Indeed, as B. Marinasi points out, he and his lips of grass are so intertwined that they cannot readily be separated. H.S. Canby too remarks on this aspect. There seems to be no instance in literary history where an author has tried so consistently from middle age to death to identify his life with his book. Lips of Grass is certainly and especially Song of Myself a spiritual autobiography of the poet. In the second sense, self in Whitman's poetry relates not to actual happenings but to imagined activities as well. In this shadowy region, fact and fancy freely mingle and blend. On this plane, the I assumes universal significance. In the third sense, the self may stand for the American everyman, a figure embodying the heroism of Civil War hero, the rugged strength and individualism of the pioneer going westward, the slave, the planter, the convict, the judge, the prostitute, in one word, everybody. Whitman's self identifies itself with other selves. It also identifies with nature or the physical world. The I finds oneness with ants and mossy scabs, with all living and even non-living beings, as is evident in There is a Child Went Forth. Self and soul, self and death. The I is seen as separate from the soul. The union between the two can give birth to a new vision which brings one closer to others, including God. This vision of love leading to a realization of universal brotherhood is the theme of Song of Myself. Self is furthermore immortal and thus unaffected by death. A self is more than the physical body. In this sense, self has grown into a cosmic figure, going beyond individual, nation, and human history. The basic theme in Leaves of Grass is the symbolic identification of regeneration in nature with the deathless self. And Whitman was untroubled and undisturbed by the philosophical problem of reconciling the individual and the collective. His eye assumes myriad identities with ease. And my dear students, I hope that you have listened very carefully up till this point, and with this with these few words I would like to conclude my lecture for today, and in my next lecture I will cover the treatment of love and sex and the treatment of death. And until then, wish you all the very best. Thank you very much for listening.